welcome back to In Search of Black Power. I'm your host, Lawrence Grand Prix. Today we want to begin what we hope to be a repeating segment for us, something I've begun to call idea contextualization. So the idea is there are certain concepts, certain ideas, certain texts, certain phrases that those of us who are watching the news or into politics, trying to follow Black politics, conversations around advancing the interests of Black people may begin to hear. And the idea is that there are critical books, the things that maybe you read, maybe you haven't, but you keep hearing about them. And the idea is to present a perspective on critical ideas relevant to Black politics, because given the nature of our media ecosystem, there are relatively few independent Black political voices that engage in direct political advocacy, but also have an explicit perspective around Black community self-determination, pan-africanism, and to put our unique reading base, our unique experiences in conversation with some of the critical ideas of the time when it comes to Black politics, Black freedom, and how we make conditions better for our community. So, one thing you probably won't hear me say often is calling these podcasts a review. Though the idea is often to engage a particular text, the term review connotes a personal, aesthetic, intellectual interrogation of the author and the quality of their work. That's not so much what I want to do. What I want to do is interrogate the ideas. Who benefits from the ideas being presented? Why do you keep hearing about them? What is the political economy around the ideas being circulated in dominant discourses when it comes to Black folks? And that's a step beyond the individual authors. And it's not personal. It's not a personal statement about the quality of the work, the morality or quality of the author of any particular text. It's more about the social, economic, intellectual, academic, and political economy around the ideas that are increasingly becoming common sense when it comes to how Black folks are being taught to think about politics. So it's in the name of interrogating this new developing common sense around Black politics that I present the first of what I hope is a series of idea contextualization podcasts. So with that, I hope you enjoy. How do we win? This is a question that has been central to Black politics since we got here as African people. And it's such a central question because it raises a fundamental conundrum, paradox. We're desperate to win the game, advance the interests of our people, but we know the game is rigged. Powerful people have positioned us so that they can benefit, score points, while we're constantly coming from behind. But why? Is it because these folks believe that the only way for them to win is for us to lose? And if that is the case, is it at all possible that if we convince these folks that us winning leads to them winning too, could we advance in the game? Could we win the game? But raising this question raises an interesting and parallel set of questions. What if the folks who are winning at the game and designed its rules know exactly how the game is played and are playing it exactly how they want to play it? It also raises another, somewhat more difficult to engage question. What if this isn't a game at all? The text I'm pulling from for this idea contextualization podcast is The Sum of Us by McGee. It is an encapsulation of a new political concept which is trying to thread the needle between what it perceives as the limited success of so-called colorblind economic redistribution policies like the New Deal, and also the backlash against color-conscious or race-based interventions like affirmative action. It bases its analysis on the tales that many of us will be familiar with from other texts like What's the Matter with Kansas, around rural folks, white folks, being willing to operate against their own economic self-interest, voting for Republicans, but explicitly frames it within the context of racial backlash, arguing in essence that white folks have been so eager to deny black folks public goods, they've been willing to deny themselves access to those public goods. And if we simply pointed this out and made a strong argument that the continued resistance to public policy hurts white communities as well, that we could begin to build support for particular types of policy interventions that would benefit both black and white communities, but would generally benefit black folks more because of our higher rates of poverty and our higher needs. And therefore, these should be considered essentially race-conscious policy, even if they are universalist and largely based upon class-based criteria. The author is pulling from their experience operating in D.C., trying to get policy passed under Obama, and seeing increased resistance to public intervention as those interventions were framed around the concept of a black president passing policies to particularly benefit the black community. When you read the text, however, it doesn't come across necessarily as is written by a policy wonk. It's incredibly personal and deeply emotional, and is explicitly framed around the concept around if we can convince those in power to see that giving black folks what they need would benefit them as well, then we can essentially make America live up to its promise as being a nation founded upon principles of equality, and essentially revive the spirit of America laid out in some of its founding documents. In fact, I'll say that realizing this actually made this podcast a bit harder to do, because we're not so much dealing with only a theory of politics for black folks in America. We're dealing with almost a psycho-existential theory about how we as black people can ethically and morally exist in the midst of an America that's done so many bad things to us, as the author actually writes about how personal this is for her, saying, quote, "I'll admit that my journey was deeply personal. At its best, this country brings together all the world's peoples and invites them to make something new. Collisions of culture had stretched the branches of my black family over the years so that it now includes white, Asian, and Latinx people too. I started off my journey when I was pregnant with a child whose grandparents would be black, white, and South Asian. I'm sure some parts of me doesn't want to believe that oppression of people of color really is unalloyed good for white people, making us truly separate and intrinsically at odds, because then the multiracial America that made my son possibly is doomed." End quote. This raises a fundamental quandary for those of us trying to interrogate as objectively as possible the logic of the arguments of the book. Has the author elucidated a persuasive theory of change to get material benefits to black folks? Or are they backwards justifying, from what they want to be true, political realities that in fact do not support the conclusion the book comes to? This is not to invalidate the stakes of the game the author is playing here, literally trying to save the soul of America. It is to say that for those of us who seek to clearly and objectively analyze the political value of the tactics she's using, we need to try to evaluate her analysis within a historical and political context that uses a variety of empirical examples to test these claims. So here's what we're going to do. I'm going to play for you snippets of the author herself explaining some of the high points of her argument, so you can get a feel for the author in her own words without the filter of me as the analyst interpreting her words. And then we'll come back and we'll give the interpretation of that text. So here is a compilation of clips of the author Heather McGee talking about some of the arguments in her book, The Sum of Us.
That buried 10 feet underground is the carcass of what used to be 1,000+ person public swimming pool. And that what happened to turn one of the biggest pools in the South into dirt was that a federal court issued a desegregation order. And instead of integrating the pool and complying with the courts, the City Council of Montgomery, Alabama voted to, effective January 1st, 1959, drain the public swimming pool, fill it in, close that park I was in, Oak Park, closed the entire city of Montgomery's Parks and Recreation Department entirely. They sold off the animals in the zoo. And they kept it closed for a decade rather than integrate. From 1959 to 1969, there was no Montgomery Parks and Recreation. So, I mean, that's just crazy, right? It's both unbelievable and yet totally believable, right? And for me, it was a real aha about what is kind of the core mystery that was guiding my journey. The mystery that compelled me to leave my job in economic policy, which was, why are we sabotaging ourselves? Why is it that we went from being the country with the greatest middle class the world had ever seen to record inequality? Why are we doing this to ourselves? I knew how we had done it to ourselves. I knew the changes in tax policy and trade policy and the changes in public investment and all that, but I didn't understand why until I came across that drained pool. And it made something make sense to me about basically that zero-sum thinking, white support for public goods really drying up once. So when I was digging into the social science data, the correlation between the sort of racialization of folks' views of what is otherwise kind of race-neutral public policy, the minimum wage, healthcare, even drilling in the Arctic, really heightened in the Obama era. I don't know if you guys remember, like, Nancy Pelosi and Newt Gingrich sitting on a couch talking about how we were going to address climate change. I don't know if you guys remember that, right? But under President Obama, you began to see all of these things that required government solutions become immediately toxic to most white moderates and conservatives, and it was more toxic the more that those voters had anti-Black beliefs. So you began to see a sort of racial polarization on things that were not even kind of racial, right? Now, I hesitate to say that, or even suggest that that is President Obama's fault, you know? But it is true that a tried and true strategy among those who were profiting economically from a weak government and from sort of self-sabotaging anti-government sentiment used that old vulnerability and began to use it and deploy it strategically. And one of the really significant parts of the story of wealth accumulation and then theft and loss is not just, you know, the stories like Black Wall Street and Tulsa and, you know, the Rosewood, those like violent moments, but also the loss of Black farmland and the example all across this country of thriving Black communities in the middle of the last century being destroyed by eminent domain to make room for highways. And those black businesses and banks and insurance companies, lost so much that they can never, that was really taken in a way that will never be recovered without the same race sensitivity to building wealth that we had for so much of our history for denying wealth to black communities.
In trying to figure out which format would be best to encapsulate my thoughts, I've settled upon basically trying to present the analysis in the author's words as much as possible, and then contextualizing that analysis with 2 or 3 points, and framing those 2 or 3 points around a segment from the text juxtaposed with a argument that I feel may challenge some of the points of the text or add context to understand more in depth some of our analysis about what we feel might be going on within the text. So with that, I'll start with my first point, which is, in a nutshell, from the perspective of the oppressor, this argument is incredibly convenient. It's extremely useful for the oppressor to convince the oppressed that the only way they can be liberated is if the oppressor themselves benefits as well. I mean, you can almost think of this like a mafia argument, where the Don agrees to do something that benefits you, but you agree to do them a favor at some point in the future, or allow them to wet their beak a little bit and skim a little off the top. To put it in a more academic vernacular, by framing reconciliation as integration, the text ultimately settles on reconciliation on the terms of the systems built by the oppressor, rather than seeing reparations as giving the oppressed the resources they need to build their own systems. And again here I want to talk about the emotional work the text is doing to justify this argument. So there's a moment in the text towards the end where the author talks about their theories of reconciliation and gives examples, and while they claim to have learned from the limitations of previous examples of so-called truth and reconciliation, I feel like interrogating the author's analysis about what they see as reconciliation and learning from examples in a Pan-African tradition around the limitations of things like the South Africa TRC, Truth and Reconciliation Commission, can be useful in understanding what I feel are the limitations of this text. So here is actually a quote from the author around a reconciliation process done in Dallas and how they think it's an example of their theory of positive sum analysis of race and oppression at work. At the Harvard Business School, Samuel Summers borrowed real jurors from a Michigan court and asked them to reach a verdict in mock trials he conducted. Of the 6-person jury Summers organized, some were composed of 4 white and 2 black jurors, and some are exclusively white people. The diverse jurors deliberated longer and performed better, in part because the white people upped their game in mixed company. Once we abandoned the false idea of zero-sum competition, the benefits of diversity become evident from the classroom to the courtroom to the boardroom. The hundreds of conversations I had on my journey convinced me that we can't do it on our own. We need a national effort rooted in community, one that brings together and has the full backing of the body that has kept us apart, the U.S. government. Our model for such a process began locally in 2017 when 14 communities across the country launched efforts known as Truce, Racial Healing, and Transformation. Experts learned from 40 truth and reconciliation processes across the globe that help societies process traumas from South Africa to Chile to Sri Lanka, but they explicitly left the word reconciliation out of the name of the U.S. effort. To reconcile, notes the TRHT material, condones restoration of friendly relations, reuniting or bringing together after a conflict, whereas the U.S. needs transformation. The framework involves a process of relationship building and healing by sharing personal stories about race and racism, but it doesn't just help people talk about race. TRHT groups also identify community decisions that have created hierarchies in 3 areas: law, separation, and the economy, bridging between the individual stories and desires, policy changes, and narrative change, accomplished by identifying manifestations of the belief in human hierarchy in our stories, be they school curricula or media portrayals or monuments. The group published an illustrated report that, when I read it for the first time in 2019, made me gasp more than once. In the opening pages, bold orange words bleed onto the edges of a 2-page spread. Quote, Dallas is on stolen land. A few pages later, Dallas was built by stolen labor. For all that I know and have written about these truths, I've never seen them stay so vividly in print in a document that spoke for a city. There have been some surprises from the Dallas THRT process. The organization's Director of Strategy and Operations, Erica Y. Flood, wanted me to know about a breakthrough moment in one of the community meetings after a presentation by a longtime black activist turned city councilwoman. Erica told me how a white suburban school superintendent raised her hand and said, "I want to apologize to you, Miss Ragsdale, because all this time, I thought you were this horrible, mean person. I only saw you on TV, and when I saw you on TV, you were agitating. You were, screaming. You were protesting. The media showed you as this bad person. I always, even as a young person, thought of you as a bad person. And I want to apologize to you because having heard this conversation, I understood why it was required for you to protest and what value you bring to Dallas." After a white policewoman mistakenly walked into Botham Jean's apartment and killed him, the local media began to fall into the trap of denigrating the black victim. But this time, 20 groups organized through the TRHT process sent a letter to local newspapers saying that the narratives that were coming out of the Dallas Police Department and the Dallas Morning News were racist. Jerry attributes this swift, coordinated response, which resulted in a meeting with the publisher of the paper about how the paper could atone to the racist narratives and do better in the future, to the emphasis on narratives in the TRHT framework. The demand for what TRHT is doing is outstripped by its capacity from all corners of Dallas society. Jerry said with a sigh, "There are now folks who are like, I'm a former accountant, and I want to do racial equity work. How do I join you all?" End quote. I think this is a good excerpt to give you a feel for how the book works, because it gives you some critical examples of fundamental tenets of the book that I wanted to present to you all. You see the research, she's citing academic articles, but you see it's really personal. It's not leading to a deep political, analytical, here's how we lobby Congress specifically conclusion. This is a fantasy fulfillment story about a black lady who was called a rabble-rouser getting an apology from a white person. So this idea of personal catharsis, proving that you're not crazy, and interracial connection, I think belies the argument the text is trying to make about this not being just people talking about race, this not being about the interpersonal connections. The entire book is about the interpersonal connections. So while they claim to have learned from previous Truth and Reconciliation Commissions and changed things and making this about policy, even the way she frames the policy analysis about separation and economic exclusion presupposes that the goal is to integrate into the structure built by the oppressor, not to fundamentally change that system. Even the way they talk about policing in the story, the grand solution is to write to the newspaper and tell them that they're racist. We didn't exactly need a Truth and Reconciliation Commission for that, But it presupposes that better media coverage about incidents of racist violence by police is a solution. Not challenging the police unions, not federal policy ending qualified immunity, not restructuring funding from police into community-controlled containers for repairing the harm of the war on drugs, all things that we've talked about to some degree on this channel. But it's news coverage and hearing the humanity of the people who are shot and not assuming they're thugs. This is why I started the podcast off with a personal story, because I do believe this is an example about trying to answer that question we proposed before, where the author's deep personal desire to believe in the possibility of interpersonal connections across race is being presupposed as politically radical, when an analysis of the Truth and Reconciliation Commission in South Africa that we're going to get to belies that without structural changes, those interpersonal connections become tools to solidify the system rather than to change it. It's also really funny, the ending of that quote. Accountants becoming DEI professionals is what so many of us critique as the cheapening of race equity and inclusion. But in this text, it's almost celebrated as a positive, that someone could just transition from being an accountant without accounting for all the money they've redistributed to white institutions and white political formations, all the laws that structurally allow them to circulate wealth upward. The simple fact that they personally want to now be involved in the Truth and Reconciliation work is proposed as an example of the success of the positive sum Truth and Reconciliation theory, as opposed to what many would say is downfall, that folks who have been part of the problem don't have to do anything more than apologize, don't have to account for the structural inequality built up in their institutions, in the law, in the wealth. The idea is that working through the process will do that. But she doesn't propose anything except the process and doesn't actually show conclusions that would commiserate with the idea this process is politically effective. Even the example she gives about the juries is interesting because that's a game. That's a game, hypothetical game they're playing about a hypothetical case that they deliberate longer. All the questions about the illegitimacy of the court system, questions of things like jury nullification, they aren't there. So the author is still very much playing a game and believes that this will help us win the game. But the stakes of the game are so high that the author really wants to believe there's something better and more pure about playing the games this way. But that may not actually correspond with achieving the results in the political process that the author has set out as supposedly the theory of the book. Here might be a good point to juxtapose McGee's analysis of racial reconciliation to the work of former civil rights activist and former Howard University professor Ronald Walters, who actually wrote a book entitled The Price of Racial Reconciliation, in that he meticulously details his analysis of the South African Truth and Reconciliation process as someone who was part of the academic, scholarly leaders movement to fight apartheid in South Africa from the position of blacks in the academy in the United States, as well as being in D.C. in the 80s with Marion Barry and engaging with the politics on the ground at the time. And he proposes an analysis of truth and reconciliation that I think is important to contextualize what McGee writes in her book. So he writes, quote, South Africa found a Truth and Reconciliation Commission, hereafter referred to as TRC, process was not possible until there was a political transition out of white majority rule. However, mere transition to black majority rule was not sufficient. Rather, the fact that the transition was pursued as a just one required consideration of other areas in which justice must be established, if white oppression was not to be exchanged for black oppression. Grubenbaum Ralph has posed substantial challenge to the process, wondering whether the TRC would be able to deal with the real victimization produced by, quote, a trauma that has an overarching historical, political, and economic context, a paradigm of racial power, which is not neutralized nor contained by the sanitizing vocabulary of reconciliation, end quote. She questioned whether a historical relativism was not being created in the memory and forgetting of who was wrong, was victimized, who suffered, and why. Therefore, she appeared to suggest that the reduction of this historical and social process to, in effect, a bureaucratic negotiation, the TRC might be unable to deal sufficiently with the trauma, but rather to facilitate a, quote, traumatic repression of the past and its displacement of the relationships between the victimized and beneficiaries, end quote. Her view implied that the TRC was not constructed to deal with the historical accumulation of the wrongs of apartheid. If it were, then its mandate was extended back in time to the promulgation of the Master Servants Act in the colonial period. Rather, the TRC had a narrow mandate that Mahmoud Mamdani has referred to as political reconciliation. The white community that had supported apartheid did not come to the table of reconciliation out of belief in racial justice, but out of the political necessity of its own survival. Adams suggested the TRC might be a vehicle for the creation of a, quote, false consciousness about the harm of apartheid, quote, camouflaging racial privilege by leaving white property relations and racial privilege intact. The assumption is that truth will lead to reconciliation, but this is demonstrably nonsense. The divorce court proves this every day. Biko's widow made it crystal clear in front of the TRC. There stood the murderers of her husband, shameless in their lack of remorse, trying to obtain amnesty on technical grounds. Why should we forgive them, even if they are telling the truth? They could receive amnesty for their crimes, then take advantage of the, quote, golden handshake of social status and other benefits, which they received as a result of negotiations to turn over power to the black majority, while the victims had to go through the lengthy, uncertain process of achieving recompense. Who were the winners and losers in this process? In the Ngoni language, the word ukwele means the rehabilitation of human life that is transformed and reintegrated into society after having done something wrong. The term uklamba is related to cleansing of both individual and community defilement. The latter is often accomplished through the pouring of libations and the expression of terms of acknowledgement and promises of corrective behavior. Both of the above examples address a process for achieving reconciliation through reparations as societal issues and processes. The TRC process, however, was narrowly tailored to achieve specific outcomes for specific violations of human rights. The accumulation of these individual cases, however, could not have made a significant contribution to the amelioration of the impact of apartheid upon most of the black population. Those affected, 87% of those whose land was taken away, who were placed on, quote, native reserves or in, quote, townships, who were brutalized and killed, who were not given the budgets to make their social development viable, who were worked in the mines for substandard wages, consisted virtually the whole of the black population. One commenter added that it must be clear who needs to be reconciled with whom, end quote. One of the criticisms of the TRC process in South Africa in this quote is that the transition to black political power alone in South Africa wasn't enough. And you were still having this conversation about reconciliation without land redistribution, economic redistribution. It would seem, despite claims by the author, that the process in Dallas had learned from previous Truth and Reconciliations Commissions, a very similar thing is happening here in America, where we did give black folks the vote, but we're trying to have a conversation about reconciliation and racial justice without redistributing the power to allow that conversation to happen within the context of equals. While we may be able to sit at the table together at a reconciliation conversation, the political imbalance of power, the imbalance of power in the police force, the imbalance of power politically, means that the framework for the reconciliation is still happening on those unequal terms. I think comparing the response to policing in Dallas, talking to the media, reminds me of the conversations had about policing in South Africa after the end of apartheid. This is supposed to be a magical moment where the country begins to heal. But in reality, if you look at the work of Frank Wilderson, his book Incognegro, and his talks about his time in South Africa, the apartheid special forces and Mandela's freedom fighters begin to work together because they believe they have mutual enemies both on the extreme right, the people who want to return to apartheid, and the extreme left, the people who want a full socialist revolution in South Africa, and they work together to attack both of them. So given that analysis, concerns about reconciliation processes shoring up state power seem to be a very relevant concern, especially given that despite their attempts to learn from South Africa, there's real possibility of the reconciliation process here in America being used to attack people who want more explicitly race-based policy, who want more explicit redistribution, who want to challenge the capitalist system, which many people would say is that partially at the heart of the policing problem the reconciliation process in Dallas is claiming to address. Later in the book, the author talks about racism and redlining being a reason why we have inequitable investment in housing in black communities, and her response is more building, more investment in housing in these black communities. I found this argument very interesting because it fits within the politics of the book, flipping the argument from not in my backyard, people don't want apartment complexes or high-rises built around the homes they own, to yes in my backyard, YIMBY, this new politics of urban density and real estate investment addressing the housing crisis through building more. Again, this is very convenient if you happen to be a real estate mogul wanting to build more real estate, because if you look at investment in historically redlined communities, those investments could be empowering if they flow through the hands of historical residents. But in Baltimore and cities around the country, there have been deep critiques of this so-called YIMBY politics because it essentially reframes gentrification as investing in quote-unquote historically redlined communities. You can invest in these communities, but not for the people there, for the people you want to bring there. And without a redistribution of power, that is the likely outcome of this investment. But it's precisely that redistribution of power that this book and McGee would risk calling a quote-unquote zero-sum view of politics. And by taking that frame of conversation off the table, you open up tons of potential exploitation of the Black community being reframed as an investment in the Black community. This is, I believe, one of the weaknesses of the book, is that it operates from her federal gaze in essentially a Democrats good because they want to spend, Republicans bad because they want to cut, and ignores all of the ways Democratic mayors in cities all throughout this country have been culpable and complicit in using state investment as a tool of anti-Blackness. And of course, what comes along with gentrification? Increased policing. And the inability of the text to focus on the ability for Democratic mayors and investment to be a tool of violence in the Black community, I think is a major conceptual shortcoming. Here it may be useful to return to McGee's example of the pool. In her example, a community in Alabama was more willing to drain the pool for everybody than allow Black folks to swim in it. And she essentially is saying, if you just get rid of your anti-Blackness, we can have a pool for everybody. But there are tons of questions that analysis leaves off the table. Who builds the pool? Where's the concrete come from? Where do the pipes come from? Those contractors, who do they subcontract to? Who does the security? The economic ecosystem around whatever is being invested in. Who controls that ecosystem? But also, what type of pool do you build? Because here in Baltimore, one thing that's happening more is we're not only building pools, we're building splash pads, with the sort of waterfalls that people can splash around in, because a lot of our kids can't swim. And understanding the unique needs of your community should be the frameworks through which you determine which specific investment meets your specific community's needs. We may not need a traditional pool because so many of our youth can't swim. But if the only thing we can get is a traditional pool because that's what the people in power want, then we're forced to essentially have, and this is coming up again a lot, interest convergence with the dominant interest, and being forced to accept that as the vista and possibility of our liberation, ignoring all the ways in which people in power will benefit from controlling the ecosystems through which these things are built, and the real reality that what they want may not match up with our community's needs. In doing this episode, I also realized how many criticisms of this text actually got pushed forward into our previous podcast. So if you haven't listened to that podcast yet, it may be a good idea to listen to that podcast, because all of the criticisms I have about universal basic income, child tax credit, all of those are really inspired by my analysis of this text. So the idea that, again, as we said in the quote from Dr. Walters about the South African TRC, the whites weren't coming to the table for racial justice. They were coming for self-preservation. And when you see how things like UBI are framed, how things like baby bonds are framed, they're framed as preserving the American economy. They're framed as preserving political stability. They're framed as preserving the advantage for the Democratic Party. But they're being sold to us as our own unique empowerment. So this idea of, you could call it interest convergence, or you could call it trying to convince Black folk that white folk benefiting from policies designed to benefit them could become a form of gaslighting, and really obscures the politics and the power relations that are not being presented when talking about so-called positive sum policies. And of course, the policing that was coming along with this. I think, again, the conversation about baby bonds, and if Black folks are already audited for claiming the earned income tax credit, framing baby bonds around wealth disparities would lead to potentially massive policing of Black folks' wealth disclosures, because the stakes of them getting all this money in a baby bond would mean that they would claim Black folk are lying about how poor they are, how little assets they have. And any revealed assets could be used to then prosecute Black folks for failed disclosure. When you leave the possibility of these investments as a tool for anti-Black violence off the table, all the ways in which the power inequities can lead to these tools of our liberation becoming tools of our policing and being attacks on our community become obscured. And we have a political imperative to, again, not talk about these limitations, because we need to present a unified front to build the policy energy, the political capital for these investments. Finally, I would say that the cultural politics of what this argument entails are very important. Maybe you could get baby bonds or UBI, but you couldn't get Ukalamba. You couldn't get a spiritual, cultural framework of investment that reflects the cultural desires of what our community sees as restoration and reparations based upon our own history and our own culture. So the inability to invest in institutions and visions of equity produced by the oppressed themselves means that we are again centering the institutions and visions of liberation given to us by our oppressor and claiming the so-called positive sum theory of social justice. In conclusion, the logic of this argument does not end zero-sum trade-off thinking when it comes to Black racial justice. It merely internalizes the zero-sum and forces Black folks to choose between investments that increase our self-determination and the possibility of getting money from a white dominant community who can only see value in the forms of investment in our liberation that also benefit them. So we're eating the zero-sum trade-off as opposed to the oppressor. It doesn't end the zero-sum. It merely shifts it from them versus us to us versus us in terms of our desire for self-determination versus our desire to get the benefits we need to survive as a community. We hope you have enjoyed the first part of our idea interrogation of The Sum of Us by Heather McGee. Upon actually doing the talk, I realized that there's actually enough content in the notes I've taken for 2 episodes. So I'm going to break up the analysis of this text between this one, and I'm going to conclude with 2 more points of analysis around the book, with a more internationalist focus, with a more historical focus around the Black freedom struggle here in America. And I'm really looking forward to some of the quotes because I think they're going to be a lot of fun and they're going to actually really hammer home some of the importance of using the Black radical tradition as a framework to interrogate what is a new breed of scholars, a new breed of scholarship around how do we win the game? How do we get free? And importantly, is this a game at all? So with that, I hope you stick with us as we continue to go in search of Black power. See you soon.